Can you believe students are still being told they can't speak basic biological truth during free time or even pray in their own schools? In Albemarle, a Turning Point student club was banned from hosting our President Victoria during their lunch meeting to simply discuss the fact that there are just two sexes. And in Nova, a volleyball high school player was told to stop praying in the locker room. These aren't isolated incidents. And, it really goes beyond just political skirmishes. These kind of things are striking at the very core freedoms, the very creational order God established for stability and flourishing. And that's why today we are also bringing you an exclusive talk from Bully Pulpit co-host Andrew Walker, who's going to talk about when our society rejects these things, that is why we see this chaos, loneliness, and despair. From the Family Foundation, I'm your host, Candi Cushman, with our President Victoria Cobb. Well, welcome, everyone. Glad to have you with us for another episode of Speak Up Virginia. We have got some breaking news updates that have happened in the last few days, and we also have an exclusive talk with Bully Pulpit co-host Andrew Walker. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. So, Victoria, it really has been striking how just in the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, this was a leader that youth all over the country really looked to for his boldness and speaking truth. That was inspiring to them. And here we have, just in the days coming out of that, these cases where students are being shut down here in Virginia, just trying to talk about basic biological truth and even just praying. Tell us what is going on.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the one where we've got a situation where our Founding Freedoms Law Center was contacted by the parents of a young girl, a high school girl, who actually had just taken it upon herself to voluntarily begin having some prayer before her games.
Yeah.
And some teammates joined in. And as always, what seems to happen is someone complains. And when someone complained, the administration basically told her that she was no longer allowed to pray before games, which is just a real stunner, and basically instruct her to go tell the rest of the team, like, we're not going to have prayer anymore or whatever.
I can't believe we're still here. I would think the adults in the room would understand our basic constitutional rights to have voluntary private prayer, free association. Christians, people of religious perspective can still get together and pray. That is a basic freedom to pray that our country was founded on, that everyone should recognize.
Well, and it's not even as old as the founder. We had a recent Supreme Court case where we've got Joe Kennedy, a coach, who got the right to pray not just off the field, and he's a coach, not even just a student.
Yeah.
And so you think about the Kennedy case, and you just sit there and think, how are they so uninformed that we still have these rights have been with us since the founding. They've been reaffirmed by the Supreme Court, even in the context of sports and high schools. So this couldn't be more on point, in my opinion, with the Kennedy case, and yet this girl's being told not to pray. So
yeah, and this wasn't even on the field or the court.
Right. It's way easier than the case that was actually at the Supreme Court. She's just praying. She's the student. She's not even doing it in the literal context of the game.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling, and I salute these kids for doing these things.
Yeah.
We should be proud of our kids that are initiating prayer. Yeah. My goodness, of all the other things that kids do in high schools, this is what they're worried about.
The good news is our legal team, Founding Freedoms Law Center, jumped in and the school backed down, and they have the freedom they are exercising the freedom they already had to voluntarily pray now. So let's jump to this other case, because this one is super interesting because it involves you. In fact, it involves your face on a poster.
My face on a poster. Yes, it does. So I was supposed to speak at a Turning Point chapter, actually at Western Albemarle High School, which is the largest, I'm told, Turning Point chapter, TPUSA chapter in Virginia, in a high school. And so I was supposed to go, and I was just set to go, speak to them. They have a regular lunchtime meeting, and I was going to get to talk about biology, why there are two sexes and only two sexes. And apparently when the student went to get their flyer approved, the principal said, nope, can't have that here.
It is just ridiculous what was told to them. It was cited that there could be disruption, and, that you're dealing with a complex, controversial issue. And that really burns me up. I'm just going to say, because
it burns me up too.
they're telling them that they can't have you speak during their lunch meeting, that they always have lunch meetings. They've had big name speakers like Bob Good and Isabel Brown.
I mean, she talks about some controversial things from time to time, I would say.
But the reason this one particularly burns me up is because this whole time they have what is it called? A gender sexuality. I have to look here.
Yes, Gender and Sexuality Alliance. So a GSA club.
GSA club.
Student club, just like this.
Also meeting during lunch in the school.
So we have a whole club formed around this exact issue.
Yes.
But if I come to talk about this issue during the same time period, it might be I think the words were disruptive. I saw that there was an email that described my content might be my mature content.
Complex.
And then complex and confusing. Was it? I can't remember, but I mean, stunning.
Radical gender ideology that we know the GSA is surrounded around every week. That to me clearly is viewpoint discrimination issues going on
here. They
never
asked exactly what am I going to talk about. So it's not like I submitted content and they went, this is too mature, too disruptive. It's just literally the title. I believe the title of the flyer, we'll pop it up there, but it was 2 genders, 1 truth, right? Yeah. So it was... That's all they knew about this, and it was enough to ban it. And I mean, so you have an entire club around this issue. I would just like to mention they're worried about this, but they're not worried about having boys and girls locker rooms because that's going on at this particular school. I just, again, this is what... There are all sorts of court cases around this idea of viewpoint discrimination, that you're going to allow one idea but not the other. This is what our whole nation was founded on.
There are a lot of just not only constitutional issues with free speech, freedom of association, but also the federal equal access right, which was designed around exact situations like this, where if you allow another club to meet during free time, you can't then tell another club they can't. That's also, during free time. So,
and especially same subject matter, but it also makes me wonder, like, what are they teaching in biology class? Is that too disruptive, too controversial? I'm really questioning.
Too complex.
Like, what does the biology curriculum teach in this particular high school? Because I have to say, if you're doing basic DNA, guess what?
All right.
You're going to get 2 genders.
They're
going to be the same as 2 sexes.
2 sexes are apparently too complex, but LGBTQIAA whatever.
Plus. Don't forget plus. That's not too complex and not too sensitive. And I think we also have to talk about the timing of this. I mean, in this moment where TPUSA has been in the limelight, and they're in the limelight because the left so hates the things that their founder put forward, that Charlie Kirk would go into a hostile environment and put forward these ideals. He was so hated that an assassin decided to take it upon himself to take his life. And this school thinks, hey, we should silence that in a different way. We have got to get to a place where ideas are not threatening, where we can have a conversation, where kids in a school can discuss things, where speakers can come in on all sides of issues and have a reasonable dialogue about this. And our kids are reacting. Why do you think TPS USA is growing like it is? It's reacting. It's growing because kids are going. Adults are trying to censor this information. They're trying to block us from getting information, and that makes them seek it.
And here's the thing with all this. If you as a school system are able to just come in and play the disruption card at any time, that gives you instant veto power, especially it's instant veto power over any viewpoint that's going to contradict the orthodoxy, radical transgender ideology that, has held sway in the school system. I mean, let's be real, out there for a while. And so you are destroying the whole purpose of the First Amendment, which is to let those that want to challenge orthodox opinions to have their say. And so for you to shut that down, that's what's called a classic heckler's veto, that you just raise the specter of, there could be a disruption, even though we have no proof of this. And like I said, they had Bob Good and Isabel Brown out, and there was no huge disruption to the school environment. And I think they're going to be okay with you, Victoria Cobb. You always say things in a really truth and grace way, so I think it's going to be okay.
I feel like I'm not really that disruptive. I'm just presenting an idea, actually, that, centuries and centuries and centuries of human beings have believed. So it doesn't feel that controversial, but controversial.
I still can't get over where this place where male and female is. This is going to create a lot of...
Well, when our founders actually put in this idea of, hey, free speech and First Amendment, the non-orthodoxy idea would have been all this radical stuff, and it would have been used. And they were saying, look, even though the world believes that God created, male and female, And now we're like completely using the First Amendment to protect our own ability to defend that viewpoint, which would have been standard for, anyway.
But they had foresight for that. But
exactly.
your point to that brings us, I think, perfectly to this exclusive talk that we're going to share with our audience today, because he's talking about how we've landed in this place in our culture around all this chaos and how we got there. And so tell us a little bit about Andrew Walker, who was our guest with our staff.
Yeah, we were super pleased to bring in Andrew Walker into our board and our staff for some, I think, a deeper conversation about these issues. Andrew Walker, in case folks don't know him, is an associate professor of Christian ethics and public theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary out in Kentucky. And he is often, folks have probably also seen him or interfaced with some of his writings that is in like World Opinions and National Review, a bunch of the kind of
First Things.
Things, some of those deeper thinking publications around these issues. And so he just really challenged us to think a little bit deeper about these political battles. I don't want to give it away, but
I mean, his talk was so rich. It was really spiritually encouraging to our staff, and it was a 2-part series, and it was long. We're not going to share the whole thing, but we're going to share excerpts, and we're going to share the first part of it today, and the second part next week. So the first part is sort of the bad news part, but the thing that's really I think our audience will appreciate is he talks about how a lot of these political battles, they're not just mere, political skirmishes. They actually get to the created order, which I think is so perfect with us coming out of this whole thing going on in Albemarle right now that, it's challenging to even talk about male and female. And he talks about how it really all gets back to what God gave us in Genesis 1 and 2 for human flourishing, and how even people that don't believe in the Bible, they still benefit from that stability and structure that God gave us for marriage and family. And when we throw that out, we see the pain in our culture. So
no question. I think he takes this to the level where it needs to be, which is getting all the way back to the spiritual, because fundamentally, when you reject the created order, you're rejecting the creator and how it's all intended to work. And we can't view this as just sort of like these are fad issues and trends and, battles that are just sort of surface.
Yeah, it just gives you encouragement when you understand what you're dealing with is so much deeper and eternal. So without further ado, let's just go right into hearing Andrew Walker.
And here's the big top line issue, if you're taking notes, is that I think all of the issues that we're facing in our culture, they present as cultural issues. But I want to submit to you that they're actually and fundamentally creational issues. I want us to use the language of creation order. If we think about what's going on in our society and what are the choke points and the pressure points in our society, it's not just that we are lonely. It's not just that the family is fracturing. It's that society and law has done its very level best to take what we see in Genesis 1 and 2, which is a framework for human civilization, a framework for how we operate and act as a culture, and we've intentionally tried to sow destruction and chaos by basically declaring war on Genesis 1 and 2. And when we think about these issues as Genesis 1 and 2 issues, they are fundamentally Christian issues because we think about Genesis being a Christian document, right? But I want us to zero out and think, well, what is Genesis? Genesis is a creational account offering, and pardon the professorial language here, offering creational normativity in Genesis chapter 1. It's setting norms, it's setting universals that we believe, even if you're not an evangelical Christian, that societies still have to arrange themselves with the grain of Genesis 1 and 2, not against the grain of Genesis 1 and 2. I want to read a quote to you. I'll have a few quotes in this talk, but a quote from Ross Douthat, conservative columnist from the New York Times. He wrote this within the last year or so. He said, "The America of today is more socially liberal on almost every issue than the America of George W. Bush. More secular, less heteronormative, more diverse in terms of both race and personal identity, more influenced by the radical ideas that once belonged to the fringe of academia. Unfortunately, in finding its heart's desire, the left also seems to have found a certain kind of despair. It turns out there isn't some obvious ground for purpose and solidarity and ultimate meaning once you've deconstructed all the sources you consider tainted. And it's at the vanguard of that deconstruction, he writes, among the very liberal young, that you find the greatest unhappiness. He says the very success of the progressive project is devouring contentment. And I actually think this is a way for us as Christians to speak into the cultural moment. Because while we care about life, marriage, religious liberty, absolutely, we're not running from those issues at all. Think even more abstractly or creationally about what Genesis 1 and 2 is offering us. It's offering us a grid or a framework for permanency and stability. And I would actually argue that it's these moral realities of permanency and stability that our society is actually crying out for right now. I've been on sabbatical the last 6 months. I've been working on a book. I was literally making some edits out on the book out there. And the thesis of my book is kind of some arguments we're going to see traced in this particular talk, but it's actually that we are what I call, and this is the tentative title of the book, we are a prodigal culture. We are a culture that has had an inheritance given to us from the Father through the Judeo-Christian tradition, but what have we done? We've decided we would rather choose autonomy, self-fulfillment, health, wealth, pleasure, and so we go off into the far country, we squander it, and then what happens when you squander that inheritance? You realize you're living with the pigs. And I actually think our society right now is crying out at the level of its inner core that we know something is wrong in how the fabric of our society is being organized. The question is, where will they turn to get the solution? And if you're following what's going on in the culture right now, there is a lot of reason for optimism and encouragement despite the insanity of the cultural moment that we're living in. We've heard of the language of the vibe shift taking place, right? What do you see happening right now in places like the UK and even here in America in some sense? You're seeing increased church attendance. You're seeing this rise of new media, and I'm going to share some quotes from individuals like Joe Rogan who are expressing a renewed openness to the reality of Christianity because they've actually figured out that terminal secularism and terminal progressivism don't give us the freedom and the joy that we thought it would. It is that language from Ross Douthat that the very success of the progressive project is to devour contentment. And you think about what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, contentment with godliness is great gain. And contentment, you have to have that through permanency and stability. That is that Genesis portrait of, again, normativity, that there is an absolute, there are universals, that we have to align ourselves with it. There's like this sense that like progressivism is dilapidated and tired. How do you explain a lot of what's happened in the last, I think, 18 months in this country? We're experiencing the terminal effects of progressivism. What happens as a result is that truth finds a way to reassert itself when we learn the consequences of what is false. And we're seeing more and more Christians wake up. I'm convinced right now. How do you make sense of the turn against the transgender issue in our culture? Because I actually think we're seeing this issue burn out because it is the terminal expression of taking human nature and fighting against it. And then what does human nature do, or what does nature do in the long run? It finds a way of snapping back. And I think that's what's happening a little bit in our society today, which is why we have so many little signals that I think we should pay attention to. So you have Elon Musk talking about cultural Christianity. You have the famous public intellectual Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who spoke at the ADF conference. If you're not familiar with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she was a Muslim. She became an atheist. In 2023, she comes out with a famous essay now called Why I Am a Christian. And she talks about why she is a Christian. And we heard her at the conference, and she has a sincere, real faith in Jesus Christ. And one of the arguments that she makes is that one of the reasons I'm a Christian is I've tried every single ideology. I've tried to base my life on the teachings of Islam. I've tried to actually be a consistent atheist. And you really can't do it because if you actually try to live those ideas out consistently, they just create nihilism and despair and depression. And she finds herself going to a counselor and saying, I've tried everything. I don't believe the counselor she went to was a Christian, but she basically says, well, maybe you should try other religions. And she figures out that Jesus is who she's been actually longing for her entire life. Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. Infinite mercy, infinite love, infinite forgiveness. Teaching a moral system embedded within the Judeo-Christian system that actually provides ideas like normativity, truth, beauty, goodness. You have individuals like Jordan Peterson, who I know we're all probably familiar with, who's filling stadiums and auditoriums with discussions about vague kind of neo-spiritualism. Now, I think he's a pretty nutty on a lot of spiritual issues, but the fact that he's piquing interest in these subjects says that the supposedly regnant, dormant secularism that guides our society does not guide our society. And in fact, secularism is its own form of the suppression of human nature because we're not just made in God's image. We're not just imago Dei, as some scholars also refer to us as homo religiosus, because there is something tied to our nature that orients us toward the divine, but secular society says, no, we're going to suppress that down. So then Joe Rogan, I mentioned this person already. In March of 2024, Joe Rogan says this: the problem with living in a secular society that has a lot of people who are atheists, who have no belief system, is that you find a belief system, and that a lot of these people that call themselves atheists have subscribed to the religion of woke. You know, their God is equity and inclusiveness. Their God is this ideology that they think you have to subscribe to, and that's why it's spooky. Human beings seem to have a very strong desire for some sort of order and form and some sort of pattern that they can follow. Order and form and pattern, what do you call that? You call that normativity script from Genesis? He goes on to say this: and they can be led. And they can be led by cults. They can be led by groups of people. They can be led by, intolerant governments and evil armies and corrupt politicians. They can be led. But I think as time rolls on, people are going to understand that they need to have some sort of divine structure to things, some sort of belief in the sanctity of love and of truth. And a lot of that comes from religion. A lot of people's morals compass and the guidelines they've followed to live a just and righteous life have come from religion. And then he ends by saying, we need Jesus for real. Has anyone followed the narrative arc of Joe Rogan? Now listen, I'm not here saying that Joe Rogan is a believer in Christ, okay? He begins his career as like a hardened atheist, embattled, bitter, God-hating atheist. Where is he now? He's attending church. We're not going to put all of our hopes in the celebrity bucket for one person converts to Christianity. But I think Joe Rogan, in microcosm form, is a picture of the schizophrenia and uncertainty of our culture and the fact that our culture is crying out for something more than what the New York Times or Columbia University can give it. I wrote an article about this at National Review last year. It's called On the Rise of what I'm calling the Tao Evangelicals, T-A-O, the rise of the Tao Evangelicals. Anyone in here read C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man? I see a number of hands go up here. Very good. If you have not read The Abolition of Man, I make all of my students read it because Lewis predicted in 1944 the culture we would live in based on the moral philosophy that he was seeing in 1944. There's this universal morality that he refers to as the Tao. The Tao is a Taoist or kind of Asian concept of what we would call creation order or natural law or general revelation, the idea that there is a universal morality. And what I think our society is doing right now is creating a lot of Tao evangelicals, people who are seeing that the path we're on is not sustainable, and we've got to, in many ways, make the choice that the prodigal had to make for himself. Does he stay in the pigsty with the inheritance that's run out, or does he do the embarrassing thing and run back to the Father? Because the thing that our society, I think, is what's stopping itself is because for us to return to the Father culturally would require us to reject the last 60 and 70 years of moral anarchy that our elites have unleashed on our society. And we all know how the elites function, right? You cannot transgress the boundaries of elite sentiment because you're on the wrong side of history. You're on the wrong side of social sentiment. The elites are wrong. And the testimony of epidemics of loneliness, the opioid epidemic, suicidal ideation epidemic, these are all proliferating right now. And I think, legitimately, I'm going to say this in the next talk. There's never been a better time to be a Christian right now than right now. Because our culture is stripping off the veneer and recognizing nothing's there. If you don't see optimism and hope in this moment, I'm not saying you need to get a new grip of reality, but you need to get a new grip of reality because there's really great things happening right now. So I want to name the three sources of our cultural demise. Okay, the three sources are this. I'll name them and then I'll quickly define them: secularism, nihilism, and barbarism. But secularism is this: it's the loss of transcendence and God from our kind of operative cultural categories, with the result that human beings define their existence by material horizons alone. Secondly, this concept of nihilism. Nihilism is the loss of purpose and meaning, which leads to fleeting conceptions of happiness that eventually requires some sort of medication to cover that gnawing sense of meaninglessness. The New York Times in 2023 had an essay from an astronomer, and I love sometimes when the atheists and the progressives just say it out loud, that it's unvarnished honesty, unvarnished nihilism. And this individual said, at some point in the future, 50 billion years from now, we have to understand there will be a point in the universe where the last sentient being will breathe its last breath, and there will be no more conscious life anywhere. And that's okay, because once conscious life is gone, we'll never have any memory that there was ever life to begin with. Carl Sagan says, we're just star stuff. We're just cosmic dust that by sheer happenstance gained consciousness through blind forces. Blind forces and involved carbon molecules do not have intrinsic moral worth to them. All it then is just some moral system devised on the basis of convention or consensus or more majoritarianism, which can quickly fade. Third category is this category of barbarism. Now, barbarism, we often hear the phrase, something is barbaric. What we mean when we say something is barbaric, it means that that person is operating without any regard for the moral tradition that has preceded them. So barbarism is a loss of moral tradition, with the result of individuals left with no sense of connection to the past, present, or the future. So we've eliminated God, so there's no accountability or standard. We've eliminated purpose or meaning, goals or endpoints or teleology. And then we don't even know how to govern ourselves truly by any type of objective moral accounting. That is actually how our society functions. I've read the books. I've read the arguments. This is what our elites tell us is actually truly comprising our existence. But what do? They don't live consistently with their own worldview. Because when the next tragedy unfolds, what's the first thing some reporter says on TV? Our thoughts and prayers are with you. Why is that? Because when tragedy strikes, a blank stare or a moment of silence doesn't really do the trick. Because your soul cries out for something deeper than just a moment of silence. Secularism, nihilism, barbarism cash out into personal ruins, social relational ruins, and transcendental ruins. Because what do these forces do in the long term? They undercut stable concepts of human nature, human purpose, and human freedom. These are all things that we have to have. We have to acquire these social stability scripts to know who we are, how we're to act, to know what we're to do. Human nature, human purpose, human freedoms. So in the area of personal crisis, what do we see right now in our society? We've got a massive crisis around the idea of what it means to be having an identity. The transgender phenomenon is actually, at the subterranean level, a question of what is my identity. We have the famous language from Anthony Kennedy, the sweet mystery of life passage where your being is defined by one's own concept of existence, of meaning. This kind of very neo-spiritual, guru, you do you, live your truth type of concept of meaning and morality. You have these phrases like live your truth, you do you. The concept of expressive individualism is a concept well documented in kind of academic literature right now, basically saying that what it means to be a human being in our society is to be a human being unencumbered by any type of authority, whether it's religious, communal. Everything is up to you, bub, right? It's up to you to have this self-determined look at the world. Are you hearing all of the talk right now about why men are skewing rightward politically? It's all over the media. I got called by Politico, and a reporter asked me, why do you think men are skewing right? And why are you seeing statistics that men are returning to church in higher percentages than ever before and higher than females? And I said, well, one of the reasons I believe is that first and foremost, the modern left has deconstructed the idea of the male to the point that, do we know what males are ontologically? Then secondly, you have the rise of Me Too that basically says if a man expresses interest in a woman, you're an abuser. If you practice the Billy Graham rule, you're not treating women appropriately, apparently. If you've seen the modern left with Dylan Mulvaney, the Bud Light trans influencer, that's the picture of what gender identity looks like for the modern left. So I said, of course, the right is going to skew probably hyper machoistic forms of male bravado, which we see that on the right now. But then also I said, why are they returning to church? Because the church is the one place in our society that can actually affirm a positive role for male nature. That you don't need to be a listless, passive man boy, that you're actually called to fruitful agency. You're called to love a woman, to make her your wife. You're called to actually care for your children, not just impregnate at will. And I actually think men, when they're encouraged to actually pursue a properly ordered purpose, they actually kind of like that message. Saying you do you to male nature is not productive for either males or the culture around it. Which is why we have scholars right now. Richard Reeves, not a Christian, works at the Brookings Institute, has started a whole organization basically saying, we need to rebuild masculinity in our culture because it's been so beaten down. We could talk more about the male crisis just on itself. I have more to say here. Think about the cultural despair. What's going on in our culture right now? We have the rise of the loneliness epidemic that the Surgeon General under President Biden documented a whole study about, that we're just not meeting together and practicing basic hospitality and sociality and friendship. Suicidal ideation is at its highest. The opioid epidemic is a real thing. Cultural despair in the sense of skyrocketing rates of depression and anxiety, even amongst Christian populations, I should add. A friend of mine is an administrator at a Christian college and says that the number of students who received psychological interventions or mental health interventions pre-2020 from post-2020, it's like a hockey stick post-2020. Shot up dramatically. Something is afoot in our culture that's destabilizing what it means to be a thriving human being. Increased polarization in our society. Do we actually have the moral resources to know how to disagree in our society? Increasingly no, which is why you see more political violence breaking out right now. Part of that political violence that's happening is because we're seeing the widening of moral universes separate. And so it creates or forces individuals to say, well, no, I don't believe Christianity. I believe in kind of Marxist, nihilistic critical theory. I want to organize society according to that standard, which, by the way, leaves no room for freedom of dissent or freedom of conscience. So we're just going to engage in political violence. I don't even have time to talk about the decline of the family. It's at its lowest. The marriage rate is at its lowest since marriage rates have been recorded. It was reported last week that the fertility rate is now at 1.6. 2.1 is the total fertility replacement rate. We're marrying later than ever before, having fewer kids than ever before, or just not marrying or not having kids. So then we get into the transcendental ruins. I mentioned this once already, the kind of the anxious generation. We have increased ideological capture in the form of, we can call it wokeism, call it critical theory, but basically we have a society that has taught its young to think in the categories of grievance, oppression, and relativism instead of truth, goodness, and beauty. I know I'm sounding like a bad news bear right now, right? Like I'm being a bad news bear because like I want us to see like how low our society is going, but then how I think it's actually potentially the church does a job to help crawl society out of the pit that it is in.
I just love at the end there how he makes the point, not everybody, we don't all have to be these huge national level world changers to live out what God has called us, even ordained us to do, to have a redemptive impact on the here and now. To that point, Victoria, I just want to mention one little thing people can do is if you know about other students or parents that, like we've been talking about, with their religious freedom rights violated, or they think that maybe they are being violated, but they're not sure, do reach out to our legal team, Founding Freedoms Law Center. That is a small way you can help set a precedent that will impact thousands of other people, just empowering the people around you to defend their rights.
Yeah, no, I don't think. I think that's what it's there for. And we get stories every day like this. I'm amazed at how often this comes up in the course of everyday activities. But I loved Andrew's point of just like live to the heights of culture. Like as a Christian, just go get married, have babies. Like that reference to sort of seeking the welfare of the city in Scripture, and just it says plant gardens. Scripture is just saying like go and be a positive influence around you, even when you're in exile in the case of Scripture. Yeah. But anyway, I thought it was great that Andrew brought that home.
We can do that with simple things, just by establishing God-structured roots in our communities, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us this week. We hope you are blessed and encouraged by the content. Stay tuned for next week when we bring the second part of his series, because this was kind of talking about the chaos. Next week is more about the hope. So stay tuned for that. And remember, if you want to help spread the word, share our Speak Up Virginia playlist. Just go to the Family Foundation YouTube channel. You can share it from there. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, give us a good review, comment. That helps it get out to more people. Remember, when we speak together, we are stronger. We are stronger when we speak together. We'll see you next time.